So any other thoughts on stumbling blocks or things that keep people from exploring their options?
So one of the big things that we deal with is people who have poor cognition, who have dementia, early Alzheimer's, and have no or very limited insight into their abilities. So these are people who are not likely to cut back on their driving, to plan alternatives, because they don't have that insight. So that is a real difficult one, and those are a big part of the clients we see at Drivewise, where we can do objective tests, both of their cognitive abilities and an actual on-road test. Some people with early Alzheimer's can continue to drive, but we need to then see them regularly because it's a degenerative disease. There will come a point where that person has to stop. So that's just something we deal with a lot. And that's all.
I find that sometimes it's very difficult to get the person to agree to go either to have their driving test by the Motor Vehicle Bureau or Drivewise. And it can be months before you can talk somebody into it. And then what do? The children are often frantic that they're unsafe drivers, and they do continue to drive. And I have, on occasion, told the children to take away the keys, because otherwise it is really an accident waiting to happen.
Is that mostly in those cases of cognitive lack of insight?
Yes, it's almost always cognitive decline, where people will not accept the fact that or acknowledge the fact that there's a problem, and won't go to be tested, because the downside of testing is that they know that if they fail, they lose their license. So it's not just testing to see what kind of a driver I am. There are real consequences to it, and so a lot of people just prefer not to do it and keep driving.
So that's a great segue into my next section, which is what are some strategies you've used to help families or patients start to explore other options or start to consider cutting back on or stopping driving? You mentioned recommending that the families disable the car, take away the keys or something like that. And does that generally work in cases of cognitive decline?
Well, it works if they don't have the keys, but it's not a real solution. I find generally that I am just brutally honest, and I say, God forbid, if you hit somebody, could be your child, could be your grandchild, you step on the gas instead of the brake, and that you could be held criminally responsible. And so I really try to be very honest with people and say that they really need to get tested. It doesn't always work. And if that's the case, then sometimes I tell the kids to take away the keys. Now sometimes they have another set of keys, and I will, hear the visiting nurse will say they've gone to the house to visit the person, and they'll see them pulling out of the driveway. So those kind of things happen too. But usually we try to make a bargain that if they will just go to Drivewise and get tested, they will be the final judges. And if they say everything's okay, then people will get off their back and leave them alone. But if not, then it means that we have to start figuring out these other options. I mean, I read all about these self-driving cars, and I can't help but wonder in 10 years if this is going to be an issue of the past. I can't wait.
And to add on that, another focus is financial, and that's always a big, it's a big conversation to have, because research shows that it costs, I think $5,000 a year at least just to own and operate a vehicle, and that's not including car payments. That's just for gas and upkeep and taxes and insurance, right? So that's $5,000. It's a chunk of money that might go toward a transportation account. So, and the other side of the financial part of it is the liability. If I'm out there driving and I have a medical condition that I know might affect my driving, and I get into a collision, and the police come and take all the information and find out, jeepers, you know, I had a medical condition that I really should not have been driving. Long story short, that information can be found out by someone who might sue me. Let's say I injure someone, or you know, I cause injury to someone. They could sue me. They could subpoena my medical records and find that I should not have been driving. And then insurance will not cover me, because when we renew our license, we answer a question. And that question is, are you aware, do you know of any medical condition that might affect your driving? Or has a healthcare provider told you that there is a medical condition that might affect your driving? So if we answer no to that, no, I don't know of any, when I really did, that, you know, I could be liable. So that's important too.
Any other strategies that you've used in working with these people that either worked or didn't work?
I've found that in a lot of times, like a son or a daughter does not want to be the bad guy, so they're looking for somebody else to pull the trigger.
Right, and you're the authority figure
Or
standing there.
I've called the son or daughter and said, there's an issue here, something's gonna be done, and they're like, well, what do you want me to do about it? I'm like, you know, right? So it's just tough, because, you know, they're looking for me to be the bad guy or somebody else to be the one to say, this is not gonna happen, and be able to tell the person, but then I do it to the registry and they become the bad guys.
Right, for the police to be the bad guy, they have to base it on an incident. They have to see it.
I can't just have a son or a daughter tell me
Right,
my mother shouldn't drive, my father shouldn't drive.
right,
I gotta find a lot more to go on than just somebody's opinion,
that's right.
even before I fill out the form to send it to the registry.
Right, right. I've heard people have had success with calling the driver in question, calling their physician and just saying, I'm really worried. This is what I saw today, you know, so if you do know the healthcare provider's primary care physician, you certainly can let them know what you see. Now, of course, the healthcare provider is not going to discuss anything about their patient with you, but you have made that call, and I tell you that from a personal experience, and that has very, very good results. But it depends on the healthcare provider too. But know that you could contact the healthcare provider.
And DriveWise is also someone who not happy, but prepared to be the bad guy. That the person may want to retain a relationship with their physician. You don't want the physician being psyched like Dr. Salomon's patient psyched his primary care. So they often don't want to be responsible or don't want to take that final decision. The family have to maintain a good relationship. They don't want to take the final decision. So having a third party, and we're an objective driving evaluation, we sometimes say, with our day in court, we'll test you as thoroughly as we can and make a decision. So that can be really helpful to the person of, well, I gave it my all, I tried everything, and great, I am still fit to drive. So, or no, I gave it everything and I really am not. So that can be helpful. And remembering as well that you don't drive a license, you drive a car. So that even though removing the license is vital, not having access to a vehicle of somebody who is unsafe is even more vital. I remember a gentleman who totaled his car. He wasn't elderly, he was in his 50s, but had a cognitive problem. And while he was in the shop, he went out and rented a car that he also damaged. So we had to really work with his family to figure out the ways of stopping that happening repeatedly.
Of course, I'm quite biased, but one thing I love about the DriveWise program is that we have a social worker is embedded in the process. We're the first person. First person that the person comes and meets with, and we're also the person who gives the feedback, which means that we're often in the room with the person who's their driving's being evaluated, and their family members, so we can be facilitating some of those first moments after hearing this news can be really crucial to thinking about how do we start planning. And one tool is what happens to the car. I mean, people often talk about making it a gift to a grandchild who's either a new driver or a driver who's not been able to have a car before, something that has meaning. And when you think about how my driving can end on my terms, and have these sort of objects that are gifts that feel like the car gets to live on, and someone else that I'm very dear, that's very dear to me, benefits from it.
And I just want to add on that at the back of the room, there's also a handout that lists not only Beth Israel's DriveWise program, but other, because I work for the state, we include all of the driving eVAL programs that we know of across the state. So if you have relatives in a different part of the state, know that there are hospitals and rehab centers in other areas that also, and they're listed on the back of this brochure.
So I'm gonna ask some of our volunteers to come around and collect index cards. If anyone has a question for the panelists, if you could write it down, and one of our volunteers will walk around and collect your index card. Just hold it up for them, and then we'll get to that in a few minutes. But I wanted to ask how, since we've identified an organization that's happy to be the bad guy, that's great. How do we get drivers to you? What are some strategies we could use? Somebody mentioned sort of making a deal with, okay, if you go to DriveWise and they say you're okay, we'll get off your back, right? That's a nice deal. For some people that might be very attractive. So what are some other ways that you can, or that you maybe have used to ease a person into just being evaluated, not into giving up the keys, but just into being evaluated?
I mean, that first way is the nice approach. You can be the not nice approach if they still refuse and basically say that if you don't go to get tested, we're going to have to call the Motor Vehicle Bureau. Nobody likes to do that, and it doesn't really happen that frequently. But that is one way to do it. This 90-year-old patient that I had who was just furious with his doctor and his children and everybody, and really felt that he was a good driver, finally agreed to go to a program similar to DriveWise at Newton Wellesley, which he flunked, and very shortly after that had a stroke. So, the idea that he could have had that stroke while he was driving was really quite frightening.
Any other advice for families who would like for a loved one to go and be evaluated?
I will just say, as a physician, it's very helpful to get a call from a family, because somebody can tell you that they're a great driver and you really have no idea. So that kind of feedback is very, very important.
So if you get a call like that from a family member, what action would you take? Would you then assess certain specific aspects of the patient, or?
Well, it's tough because you certainly can't reveal the phone call, because, that really wouldn't be good for the relationship. But you can then talk about the medical conditions that the person has, and say that I really feel that, your driving needs to be evaluated. But the truth of the matter is, when I get to them, it's usually not the first time they've heard it. Their kids have usually been all over them that it's time to get tested. And so it's just one more voice.
But do you find that yours is a different voice because you come from a sort of a position of authority in that person's life?
Sometimes, on the other hand, the contact I have is so infrequent that it may have even less of a, less of a strength than somebody who knows them. But I think it does help, and I usually am prepared to be the bad guy so that the relationship between the children and the parents can be maintained.
Okay, any final thoughts before I get to, I've got some great questions here. Any final thoughts that anyone wants, anything that you wanted to say before I start asking the questions? Okay. Probably one for the RMV, Michelle. Do other states test all elderly drivers periodically? And if so, does this help, and should Massachusetts follow suit?
Great, that's a great question. Not all states have a relicensing policy based on age. The majority of states do. I believe 40, I believe there are 40 some odd states that do have a relicensing policy, but there's no federally mandated policy, so it's up to the individual state. Most mirror Massachusetts policy, where they would require a vision test every 5 years or however many years. New Hampshire years ago required a road test of their drivers, their older drivers. I believe the policy was if a person was 72 or older in New Hampshire, a resident of New Hampshire, they had to take a road test in order to renew their license. And after about 5 years of having that policy in place, believe it or not, there was no change in the number of older driver collisions. So that was interesting, and I just throw that out there. That was research that was done. So New Hampshire then determined that wasn't the best assessment, the road test. So they now require an eye test, but most do require an eye test.
Great. So 3 people asked this question, so I think I should ask it. Basically, if DriveWise determines the person can no longer drive safely, but the individual rejects that recommendation. So I think what most of these people are asking first is, if I take the DriveWise course and I fail, do I lose my license? What happens?
Our judgment can be one of 3 things, basically. One is the person is safe to drive, and we may put some reassessment on that you're safe to drive, but because you have a deteriorating illness, you have a dementia, then we need to reevaluate you every 6 months, and that comes not from us, but from the American Academy of Neurology. So the other side of it is that the person is not safe to drive, and we take this decision very seriously, and we look at all the tests, we look at the performance on the road test, we talk about it as a team, social worker, myself as occupational therapist. We have a great neuropsychologist who consults with us. We can also pull in advice from neurologists, from the person's primary care physician. In that case, Amanda can tell you better than I, the person gets this in written form, and the social worker talks it through with them. In most cases, the person and the family will decide that they can abide by that, they will no longer drive, they come up with different resources. We only report to the Registry of Motor Vehicles where we believe somebody who is unsafe to drive is going to continue. The middle ground that I didn't talk about is those people who made some errors on the road, but we think have the potential to be a safe driver. And we can recommend a course of remediation, that they go away, work with a driving instructor to work on those specific issues. It might be the person's not scanning on lane changes, so he's making unsafe lane changes because they're not scanning the mirrors enough. And so they can work on those skills with a driving instructor, come back and be reassessed. Do you want to add to that, Sister?
Well, so the question is, if I think I'm safe to drive, DriveWise says I'm not, what happens? And DriveWise is binding. So that means we're not the law, we are not taking over anyone's role, but we work with the RMV. So we would report if someone says, and people have said to us, I disagree, I'm safe. And in that case, we have information at that point that they are unsafe drivers and that they intend to do something that puts themselves and others in harm's way. So we do report.
And then once the registry makes a decision and suspends or revokes a license, the license holder always has the right to a hearing. So even though we make a decision that seems to be final, each and every one of us has the right to request a hearing.
Okay, so kind of on a follow-up, just kind of digging a little deeper into that. Let's say that the person is deemed not safe to drive. While they're sitting in your office, they say, okay, yep, you're right, I'm giving up my license. They go away, and 6 months later, you get a call from a family member saying they're still driving. Do you have the ability to go back at that point and make the report to the RMV, or do you call them back in? What would you do in that kind of situation?
In that situation, we would report to the Registry of Motor Vehicles, because it's unlikely that somebody who is unsafe and who the family are saying they're still driving, we're frightened, we're worried, it's unlikely that their driving will have improved. So we would report that person to the registry, and then the registry would follow their processes.
I want to add one thing, and I sort of hesitated saying this because it feels we're talking about driving retirement, but at DriveWise, one thing that's really important to us is never to take a license early. So the goal is to do it at the right time, and that's easier said than done because we don't have a crystal ball, but we don't want to, if someone's on the edge, we recommend remediation. We don't say, oh, we'll fail them just to be safe, because driving is important, and planned driving retirement is important. So our interest is really not in removing licenses. It's not in doing it early. It's really trying to do to the best of our ability at the right time.
That's a great point, and based on the healthcare provider's advice, the registry could even issue a license, a restricted license, that would allow the person to drive only with a licensed driving instructor, and that way they can either correct a bad habit or work on, becoming a better driver again. And maybe they were in rehab and away from driving for a while, so know that the registry can issue, based on a healthcare provider's advice, we can issue what's called a restricted license. So that's an option too.
Okay, so that's a good segue into this next question. What resources are there to modify the car to make driving safer when a driver may have hearing or motor limitations, not cognitive limitations, but more hearing or motor limitations?
There are a lot of adaptations that can be made to a car for physical limitations. And that depends on what the physical limitation is. Simple ones can just be things like bigger mirrors or readjusting mirrors. There is a program called CarFit where the person can take their car and have someone tell them how to better adjust their seat in the mirrors so they get better vision. That's a very simple one. There are adaptations for people who have limited physical abilities, so people can drive with left foot gas and brake if they don't have any function on their right side. They can drive with hand controls, but all these require learning. They require, re-education. The driving instructor that we work with is an expert in driving adaptations. So in those sorts of cases, we would refer to him because he can adapt his own car, teach the person how to use the adaptations, and then help them get their own car adapted.
Officer Reardon, have you ever seen any of these kinds of adaptations in action?
I've seen knobs on the wheel. Sometimes you'll see something where they can turn on a wheel. They've modifications to like the brakes or things for people with disabilities, stuff like that, but not too often.
And I must say, we don't frequently use these with people, but there are people for whom that's required. The steering wheel knobs are only legal in Massachusetts if you need them for a medical condition. So they used to call them suicide knobs, people just used to use them, but they're legal if you need them for a medical condition. And that might be somebody who's using hand controls So it's usually doing gas and brake with their left hand, so they need to be able to control the wheel with their right hand. Most, not generally something that people deal with.
We've got a couple of questions about Uber, but we'll save those for the next, the June event, unless we have a few minutes at the end. So, as you gradually give up some driving, are skills being lost? I think this is someone who's worried that the less they drive, the less good they'll be at driving. In your experience, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that is a difficult one. Some research has indicated that driving, people's drive better per mile. There are few accidents per mile driven, so that people who drive more miles have fewer accidents, fewer crashes. However, if you're concerned and if you feel that your abilities are not as sharp as they used to be, then it does make sense to start putting limitations on yourself. And those limitations that we've already talked about. Maybe don't drive at night. Don't drive when the weather's inclement. And that's because as we age, all of us lose contrast sensitivity, have difficulty with glare. So at night or in poor weather conditions, it's more difficult. I'm noticing that. I'm in my 50s. I'm now thinking, geez, I don't like driving at night so much.
I was going to say, I have a friend in Beverly, and every time I go see her at night and I'm coming back on 1 or 1A, I can't see the lane markings. Yeah, so it's really difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, so it is sensible to put in some restrictions, but not to limit yourself so much that you start to lose skills. You're not likely to lose your basic skills. Driving is an overlearned task. It's something that we do automatically. I don't know about you, but I've done it where I've been driving to work and I get to a light and think, how did I get here? I hope I stopped at that stop sign back there.
Because you're lost in your own mind.
And surely, I'm sure I did do everything, but it's such an automatic, it's an overlearned activity. It's not something we have to generally think about.
So it is possible, to answer the question, it is possible that the less you drive, you are losing some of those skills.
Yeah, slightly, yeah.
Yeah. So
There's a
another
flip
reason.
side too, though, if there's an issue why you're losing skills, and it's because of something deteriorating, it's gonna go the other way. And more driving's not gonna help that,
Exactly.
you know.
So what might be a good way to distinguish between those two situations where you're feeling like you're not as good a driver as you used to be? Is it because I'm driving less, or is it because of something that I need to be, worried about? Is it about a medical condition? Or I guess you talk to your physician. Is that what you would recommend, most of you?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the first step to really have that conversation, that honest conversation with the healthcare provider. With the eye doctor, for instance. If I say to my eye doctor, I cannot see as well at night, they may be able to prescribe me nighttime driving glasses, or so cover your bases, and I always look at it in terms of liability. Ask that question. Put it out there with your healthcare provider. What do you think? Is this knee operation going to affect my driving, or should I not drive? So better to put it out there and get the answer.
And what we often see is that people, when you say losing skills, it can mean a number of different things. Some people restrict their driving to not driving at night, for example, or not driving in poor weather, but they still are driving on a regular basis. You're going to retain skills. Other people we see have had an accident and weren't able to drive for 6 months, or are snowbirds, and wherever they go, they don't drive as often. So there's a real gap in their driving for a multi-month period. Then you might see, I think, the person might notice more of a decline in driving. Whereas if you just are shifting some of your driving, you might not notice that a change in your skill level or your comfort level.
And there are a lot of driver's ed schools. We think in terms of driver's ed schools as teaching teens how to drive. But a lot of driver's ed schools will teach me. They'll welcome me to, give me an hour lesson just as a refresher. So keep that in mind too. I do know people that have, been in rehab or away from driving, as you said, Amanda. Excuse me. And they're a little reluctant to get back behind the wheel, but an hour with a driver's ed school really can get that confidence back and get that person more comfortable. So, it's a complex skill for sure that needs practice.
And driving in Boston might require special instruction.
Patience.
Yeah, how to use the horn. So maybe this is one for Emily to start out with. What about using therapeutic fiblets? I love that term. What about using therapeutic fiblets for people who have cognitive impairment to take the car away?
That's actually a term that the Alzheimer's Association uses with their caregiver when they're teaching caregivers on how to have conversations with a family member with dementia. They call them fiblets. So I think fiblets can be really helpful as long as they're not kind of bald-faced lies, but you can use them as a good tool to kind of look at what are some other options. Oh, the car is going to be in the shop for a week, so why don't we test the senior center's transportation program and see how that goes for you. Just kind of little things like that to kind of test what's out there and to test the willingness of the potential non-driver to use other services and to experiment with those other services. So I think fiblets can be a very helpful and useful way for family members to talk to the older driver.
And again, this question was asked in the with the specific cognitive impairment. So if someone is not cognitively impaired, it's a different picture. But yeah. Any other thoughts on therapeutic fiblets? Little white lies. Or any other tips for dealing with drivers who are dealing with cognitive impairment specifically and that lack of insight? Any advice for families?
I am often have people who are cognitively impaired who really perseverate on the driving. I know that whenever I see them, even if it's every 4 months, every 6 months, within a minute of getting into the conversation, it's, when am I getting my license back? I want to drive, I'm a safe driver. And I do find, whether it's a fiblet or just changing the subject, that you just have to do it, that it really doesn't help to continually say you're a terrible driver, you've had an accident, you're not safe, but rather to just change the subject.
I think that could be a panel discussion all in itself for another 2 hours. So here's one. It says, for RMV, so I'm assuming this is Michelle. If people check off that they don't know of any medical conditions preventing them from being a good driver, but due to the lack of insight into their own cognitive condition, can they still be liable? So again, this is a cognitive impairment question. So if someone doesn't acknowledge that they've got that issue, so they check, no, I've got no issue, are they still liable? I know you're not a lawyer.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not quite sure what the answer is, so I'd like to check with medical affairs on that and somehow get that answer to the person that asked it, unless the panel knows. That's a really good question.
I can put it up on the website.
Yeah, that would be great.
The website's on the program.
My initial response would be that Massachusetts is a self-reporting state. So that's what the law says, that if I know of something, all the responsibility falls on the licensed driver to report it. So, but if you don't know, that's a great question. So I will find out for you.
Okay, so we're coming up on when I wanted to wrap up, so that I'll just throw this out here since we do have a couple extra minutes. 2 questions about Uber. Do you guys have any thoughts about not just Uber but Lyft? There's Fasten, there's this new Chariots for Women ride-hailing apps that people use. Do you have any experience with seniors using those? And if so, are they helpful? Do people adjust pretty easily to those, because those are a different animal from a lot of other options.
My experience, although I don't know, my experience is that people have not adapted to the smartphones as much as they have to computers. And I don't know of any patients that I have that use Uber. I think if they did, it would be phenomenal. I think, you know, when you talk about financially and $5,000 a year to keep a car, you can do a lot of Ubering for $5,000. So it would actually be a great thing if even Uber could come up with some kind of a simple thing, you know, even if it's not a smartphone, just some kind of a button that you can push to call Uber
Can't come get
or
me.
Lyft
I
to
mean, it
come
is
get
such a
me.
convenience, you know?
It's phenomenal.
Yeah, before, as they're passing the mic, I wrote an article on the blog recently, $725 per month. AAA did a study that the average driver in America pays $725 a month just to own a car. And that's the average driver in America, not Boston, where I pay $150 a month for parking personally. So, yeah, factor that in. That's a lot of ride hailing, that's a lot of taxis, that's a lot of even home care, you know, someone, hiring someone to drive you around for your weekly errands. You can do a lot with $750 a month.
I actually, a lot of the people I meet with through DriveWise and also through our work, I'm in the cognitive neurology unit, so I work with a lot of older adults with cognitive impairments, and many of them use Uber. One strategy for people who are not comfortable with their smartphone or don't have a smartphone and it's not really a reasonable solution for them to get one and learn how to use it is I work with the children to install Uber on their own phones. And for those of you who haven't used Uber, you don't have to be in the location to have it pick you up. So for example, if I was calling an Uber for Anne and she's at the hospital and I'm here, I could put the hospital's address into Uber. It would pick her up. I would inform her of the driver's license plate so she was getting in the right vehicle, and I would be the one charged, or whatever credit card we've determined to be the one associated with that Uber account would be charged. So a lot of adult children will do this as long as their parent or the person who's needing the vehicle has a cell phone. And many people do have cell phones even if they're not smartphones. So that's what we've been using.
And you know the location, because you're programming it for them. Your parents, you know they're going to their home or to wherever they want to go.
And adult children really like this option because they also know that their loved one's getting there, because they know they can track in the app where they're going and that they've arrived safely. So it's a really reassuring solution for a lot of people who don't live close enough or not able to give their parent a ride.
Yeah, and the parent or the loved one doesn't have to deal with money, because with Uber or these ride organisations, it's all billed through the app. So rather than thinking, well, Mom's going to get a cab, has she got enough money? Does she know the appropriate tip to give? This is a way around that. So we find it more and more, it's a great resource.
Yeah, so I'll just add on to that. So Trips, we're actually working on setting up an Uber Buddy or a ride-hailing buddies program where we have someone identify someone in their lives, maybe an adult child, maybe a friend, maybe a neighbor, who's their ride-hailing buddy, who installs the app on their phone. And then also when you're calling a ride for someone else or yourself, you can have more than one credit card on the app, and you can select which one you are going to use for that ride. So the adult child can have their own credit card on their phone and your credit card on their phone, and if they call a ride for you, they can charge it to your credit card instead of theirs. So technology is catching up with this stuff, and we're trying to keep up with them to give people options. We think it's a great potential solution for a lot of this. So it's quarter till, so I'll kind of wrap up now, and I wanted to remind everyone that on June 16th, we're going to have the second part of this panel, which is going to be a lot of our volunteers sitting up here who already get around without driving, telling you their own stories. So how they came to not drive. Some of them have never driven. Some of them gave up driving just a couple of years ago, and they'll tell you why and how and what that was like. Some of them gave up driving 10, 20 years ago. Some of them moved specifically to Brookline just because they knew it was a great place where they didn't have to drive. So they really integrated that driving retirement plan into their retirement plan. And here they are, they're taking advantage of everything. So on June 16th, we're gonna have those folks up here. They're gonna, their enthusiasm and their energy and their positivity is infectious, and I hope that you'll come back for that and see people who actually do it in the flesh. And I'd like to thank our panelists for giving us their time tonight. What a powerhouse of information we are. Also wanted to thank Brookline Can for sponsoring us again, and please do make sure to check with them on the way out if you're interested in joining. And the feedback forms, I'll ask for those again, and I think the box is on one of the, yeah, it's on the Brookline Can table back there. So if you'll drop that, we'd be very grateful. Thank you very much for coming.
Nice to